All right. Welcome everyone to the Matrix Conversations and Transformations. This is a seminar series from the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice in Los Angeles, California, that features innovative experts, scholars, artists, and activists. I'm Professor Heldman, the chair of the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice, and I am joined by my co-organizers of the Matrix, CTSJ professors Claire Crawford and Malik Muazzam Dolat. Next week, we have a conversation with Shetal Sheff on intersectional sexism in Hollywood, and you can register for that at oxy.edu/matrix. Today, we are excited to be joined by Salam al-Marayati, president and co-founder of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. One quick housekeeping note, you can submit your questions for Salam at any time via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to them at the end of the interview. And now I will pass the baton to my esteemed colleague, Professor Muazzam Dolat.
Hello, everyone. So this event is being co-sponsored with three organizations on campus at Occidental College. The McKinnon Center for Global Affairs, headed by Professor Derek Shearer, Ambassador Derek Shearer. The Young Initiative on Global Political Economy, which is currently being chaired by Professor Anthony Chase, and the Manassa Student Association. So thanks to all three of them for their ongoing support, not just on this event, but on other events as well. So today we are happy to be joined by Salam al-Marayati, president and co-founder of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. Al-Marayati is nationally recognized for his commitment to improving the public understanding of Islam and policies impacting American Muslims. He oversees MPAC's groundbreaking civic engagement, public policy, and advocacy work. He's an expert on Islam in the West, Muslim reform movements, human rights, democracy, national security, and Middle East politics. He has spoken at the White House, Capitol Hill, and represented the US at international human rights and religious freedom conferences. His writings have appeared in every major national news publication, including, but certainly not limited to, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the LA Times. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation with Salam about the organization and its work, but please put your questions in the Q&A about any of the things that are going on, and we'll get to them towards the end, as Professor Heldman indicated. Okay, so let me just get us started. Not only have you appeared on all those great publications, but you've also appeared many times at Occidental College. So we've been blessed to talk to you a number of times, and really a couple of times over the past couple of years. But to my recollection, I don't think we've ever talked about the origin and mission of MPAC. And I was wondering if you could tell us how you came to create MPAC, and really also why, who you aim to serve, and what needs it fulfilled in the community, right, at the time and now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, professors, for inviting me to this very important forum. I always enjoy coming to Occidental and talking to bright minds, and I really enjoy, I learn a lot actually myself from these discussions. So thank you for the opportunity. I was 26 at the time, and I was an engineer working in a company in Irvine, California, but I was spending a lot of time volunteering for the mosque. And I had said to my mentor at that time, Dr. Maher Hattout, you know, I'm spending more time with the mosque, you know, planning activities and events, yet I'm drawing a salary from a company that I'm not really spending the time with. So if we're working for justice, isn't there something wrong here? And he agreed and finally said, okay, come on over. And I started full time at the Islamic Center with what was called at that time the Public Relations Committee, because even, you know, at that time there was so much anti-Muslim animus in culture. It preceded 9/11. There was the hostage crisis in the Middle East. There were wars going on in the Middle East. There was the Iranian Revolution that raised so many questions about Islam and Muslims. So that's why we started MPAC, is to answer people's concerns, whatever you needed to know about Muslims, but were afraid to ask. We made MPAC that place where you can come and ask those questions. Then we got into government relations and policy and political organizing after that.
Got it. Let's see. Let's see here. So Claire, I think you had a question.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. So when thinking about impact in the activist community, it's known as a valuable coalition member. Can you talk about how you negotiate serving your community while also working and living in coalition and solidarity with other groups? What are the benefits and challenges of forming coalitions?
That's a great question. You know, we're only 1% of the population. Muslims comprise maybe a little more than 1%. We have 3 members in Congress, which is about 1%. So we're the smallest of minorities in America. So we're not going to really have our voices heard unless we have coalition partners. And this is the model actually of Islam. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, developed coalitions at his time. I mean, it was all about warring tribes. So you had to have pacts with other tribes for the sake of survival, for strategic purposes. So this is nothing new. The challenges obviously is you're developing coalitions with people you don't agree with on everything, and sometimes you agree with very little. But the prophetic model is that you engage people and convert them from enemies to friends. And I believe that's both an opportunity and a challenge in coalition partnership. That if there's a common ground of 10%, you try to make it 12% and 15% and so on and so forth. We've actually been excluded from coalitions because of our stands before, because our stands on Palestine, for example. We were excluded from coalitions in Los Angeles. And we've been excluded from coalitions by people that we have a lot in agreement with, but they believe that we didn't take a strong enough stand against the government. So we've been on both sides in terms of being excluded, but our aim is to really work with anyone and everybody as long as that common ground and objective is clear.
So I have the next question. Wondering about your levels of work, Salam. So you're working at the federal level. Obviously, grassroots activism is important. Messaging is important. Your focus at the federal level and aimed at the federal government. Why do you focus at the political at this level? What is at stake here?
Well, I think it's, everything comes down to politics when it comes to Islam. It is a political football in America. And, for example, the word jihad and the word caliphate and the word Sharia are in the news all the time. Our politicians use it. And I'll talk a little bit more about it when we get into national security policy. And so it is a political football. So you need to learn how to play football in order to answer their fears, address their fears. And make yourself known on the field. So our aim is to make Islam and Muslims a positive, integral, enriching element of our society. And you can't do that without dealing with the political obstacles in front of you. And that starts obviously with the federal government, where we have a lot at stake. But it also involves state and local politics as well.
Yeah, that's right. That's great. And we can get into this later, but as I understand it, you have a pretty solid program that puts young Muslim people in the Congress working and interning. Is that right? What's that organization or that program called?
Yeah, Congressional Leadership Development Program. And with this cohort, we just got somebody staffed with Senator Feinstein's office. And the idea is that MPAC is the pipeline for young people to learn about the landscape of Washington, D.C., to learn how to get jobs in Washington, as well as in Hollywood. We have the same thing here through our Hollywood Bureau, because at the end of the day, that is what drives people's misunderstanding or understanding of us, is public opinion and public policy.
That's right.
And so we have a lot of talent in our community, and we want the best and brightest to work and become that nerve center, which is called Washington, D.C., that tells us how to think, as well as work in Hollywood, which tells us how to feel. And those are the two areas we focused on.
Got it. Okay. Well, let's maybe think a bit more about the national security aspect to this. I first became aware of MPAC when I was working on civil liberties issues in the wake of the passage of the Patriot Act and the massive expansion of state power around the global war on terror. Your work on civil liberties and against the abuses of national security was crucial then, and it obviously continued to be so important, still important now. So I thought maybe we could talk about this recent report that you have put out and are developing and working on that points out the inequities in the use of terrorism laws at home, right? And so it's this distinction between the foreign terrorist organizations and domestic terrorist organizations. And I thought it might be good to start there, thinking about national security, since that's the most recent work.
Yes, the work involves this double standard that we have in the investigation or application of counterterrorism policy. So if I, as a Muslim, am being investigated by the government, then I am categorized as a foreign terrorist organization under that foreign terrorist investigation. Yet if a white Christian male is being investigated, he will be placed under domestic terrorism investigation. And the two are worlds apart, obviously. So for example, I don't get the same civil rights that he does. My assets can be seized. There could be secret evidence used against me. My community can be infiltrated, with agent provocateurs, which is the Fazaga case that we're going to talk about later in Irvine, what happened many years ago, and so on and so forth. So it's only because I'm a Muslim that I'm being placed under foreign terrorist investigation. And also to say that that's a domestic terrorist organization is a misnomer as well, because now white supremacist groups have transnational connections. New Zealand, Norway, Germany, throughout Europe, and so on and so forth. It is as international as any other terrorist network. But the idea that for Muslims, there's a conspiracy, a worldwide conspiracy against the West that goes back to the clash of civilizations. This is where the double standard comes from. And we have to deal with that root cause if we want to be effective, number one, because there's a waste of counterterrorism money. You probably read about the NYPD case where they were following Muslims, but they ended up just gaining weight because they were eating too much hummus and going to hookah bars, probably had bad lungs. It was a waste of money tracking down these so-called foreign terrorists, which there isn't in the United States. And the cases that we have, even though they were horrific in San Bernardino or Orlando or Boston, white supremacist violence still surpassed that by leaps and bounds. Yet the feeling towards a Muslim committing an act of violence is much greater in America than that feeling when there's a white supremacist act of violence. It's still that us versus them. Well, these are our extremists. They're not as bad as their extremists. So that is in play in terms of our policy, in terms of how civil rights of a whole community is suspended, and how the U.S. government is going after a phantom called the Islamic threat.
That's a great tie into the next question, which is about the so-called U.S. war on terror. So the last time we talked to you, it was a discussion about the genocide of the Uyghur Muslims in China. Can you talk about the way the U.S. war on terror contributes to and even legitimizes attacks on Muslims by other states?
Yes. So in the case of the Uyghurs, the case of the Rohingya Muslims by Myanmar, the government of Myanmar, in the case of Indian Muslims by the Indian government, In case of the Palestinians, by the Israeli government. All of them are subjected to the US playbook on counterterrorism. What these governments do, China, India, Israel, Myanmar, they use the United States playbook on counterterrorism and say, well, we're going after these Muslims because they are terrorists. And they are, and they use three elements. They are not indigenous to the population, they're alien. So they're not really part of the region. And you read stories about Israelis trying to say that Palestine never existed. Remember what the Serbs said about Bosnians? They're not real. They're not really Slavic. They're Turks, and so on and so forth. That's number one. That they're not indigenous to the land. Number two, that they are inherently violent because of jihad. And number three, that they are trying to take over. There's a hostile takeover because of Sharia. And nobody knows what Sharia or jihad means. They just say it. And and as Hitler said, if you repeat a lie enough times, it becomes a fact. So that's the propaganda that's being used against these people. And they're all using the US counterterrorism playbook to dehumanize and then commit acts of genocide against these populations.
I think that's also a perfect segue into thinking about human security. So MPAC has developed a white paper on thinking through the war paradigm, changing from this national security approach, this kind of power security approach to human security. I know really the human security conversation comes up really starting in 1994 with the UN's National Development Program. They released a report, right? The new dimensions of human security, right? And they established then that human security is concerned with how people live, breathe in society, how freely they exercise their many choices, how much access they have to market and social opportunities, and where they live in conflict, whether they live in conflict or in peace. And the components that they pulled out then were economic, food, health, environmental, personal, community, and political security. Something that I was interested in a couple of years ago, going back with my IR hat on, thinking about durable human security, right? So like, how do we make it cyclical, right? How do we actually create societal norms? How do we actually create institutional missions that states are not only functioning, providing human security for communities, but is set up in a way where if conflict rises, that we know how to go back into it. So I'll be interested to hearing more about the transformation and the additions that your white paper is putting into human security.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So in the case of Afghanistan, I think this is a perfect example. The national security apparatus was set up in Afghanistan. You create a military garrison in Afghanistan, then you develop alliances there, you try to prop them up, you give them money and military aid, and we all know how that ended. It was a paper tiger that folded as soon as the United States announced its withdrawal. So the national security apparatus that we have in the United States is a failure, and we have to acknowledge that first. We spend about $1 trillion on national security. Most of it is going after so-called Islamist threats. And the way that we deal with it is through military and law enforcement hardware, intelligence gathering, surveillance, military operations, drone strikes. And if you ask the average American, do you feel more secure now than you did 20 years ago? I think the answer is no. Most Americans will say, no, we don't feel more secure. And that's because the United States policy is set up on geopolitical interests. Why do we, why the United States actually supported the Taliban back in the 80s and the 90s, and how strategically this played with China, India, and Pakistan. Why do we do what we do in the Middle East? Because how it plays with Israel, and making sure that we have the military advantage, that Israel has the military advantage throughout the region, and that the oil supplies are controlled by Western companies, and that friendly tyrants are kept in power. The two allies of the United States right now are Saudi Arabia and Egypt, a monarchy and a military dictatorship. That's a flawed policy. And what we're saying is that if we thought about human security and invested in human security, we would win the support of civilian populations, and it would be more sustainable. It would be more permanent than these paper tigers that we're trying to set up in Iraq or Afghanistan, or, you know, God knows where we're going to be next. And human security, as you said, was developed by the United Nations in 1994 in terms of economic development, human rights, sustainable education, development of technology. It actually roots back to a speech by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1947, where he talked about the four freedoms: the freedom of speech and expression, the freedom to worship, the freedom from fear, and the freedom from want. And we know what the freedom of speech and expression means, and freedom of worship. Freedom from fear is, you know, the fear because of the armament throughout the region that the United States is the #1 supplier of. And I'm heartened to hear finally one U.S. Senator, Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut, who said in a Senate hearing, you know, maybe if we send less weapons to the Middle East, that might be a better way of gaining security rather than just arming it to the teeth, which is not going to get any security. So people are beginning to think about that. Freedom from want is freedom from the want that, because they don't have education systems. They don't have economic development. So to develop that instead of a national security apparatus in these countries would, #1, use our tax dollars in a much more effective way, win the hearts and minds of these populations that we need. They would then support, or at least we would engage them in a much more organic process of policy in the region. And it wouldn't just be on geopolitical interests, it would be on the interests of the people. And that's, at the end of the day, what human security is driving at. We need to think about the interests of the populations, of the civilian populations, security for the population, not just security for our military assets and other government assets throughout the world.
If I could ask a follow-up, or no, just like a quick follow-up is thinking about, really thinking about oppression as part of the cycle that comes in post-conflict construction spillover, right? So you're speaking about, I live downtown, so sorry for the background noise if you hear that, like in this post-conflict construction, you know, we have all these laws that come up. You're speaking about it, how we've wasted time kind of targeting populations, Muslim groups. And so oppression then becomes part of the erosion and the institutional norm. How do you think in placing, like putting back in human security, this kind of people-centered approach will help with that part too, right? So then we don't have to, you don't have to advocate consistently for like MPAC wouldn't spend so much time being like, yes, you can come talk to us about how to talk to Muslim folks or understand our culture, who we are as people, because we then create this oppression factor in post-conflict spill. And then we then just continue in this way where it's geopolitical, even domestically, right? Even in your own home, you have this geopolitical politics that you don't even understand because you only see and you're being fed in a certain way. So even then, your whole approach in protecting yourself, even if you've never left your state, becomes very like national security realist approach of just like go weapons, go out, arm to the T.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think just what's happening to law enforcement, finally, you know, our governments are rethinking the whole approach in terms of how much we need to be arming our law enforcement versus bringing in community-based programming that helps build a better community and a better society. And I think that's the same approach we're talking about in terms of international policy. And you're exactly right. You know, what happens after the United States takes over a certain country and we prop up certain leaders there, they become tyrants themselves. And there's more oppression on these indigenous populations. And it behooves us to think, why is it that the worst anti-American sentiment in the Middle East is coming from Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And that's where the 9/11 hijackers came from the Gulf and from Egypt. Yet they are the strongest allies to the United States, because people see that the United States is financing and supporting and protecting these tyrants. And so we have to deal with these, what the government tries to say, well, let's talk about root causes of terrorism, this social alienation and economic poverty and lack of education. Yeah, but it starts with the governments that don't invest in that are being propped up by the United States. And then the United States kind of throwing their hands up in the air. Oh, we don't know because Saudi Arabia is so powerful. It's telling us what, it's kicking us around. No, it's not, and it can't. So we have to deal with the reality of one of these, aspects of our policy that is setting up or supporting these tyrants and oppressive regimes, and they're doing it in the name and being financed by the United States. And then we wonder why there's anti-American sentiment. But to be in real effective communications with the people, that's a different set of opportunities then for us. And the United States will come to us as a nonprofit organization. Well, yeah, we want you to go and talk to the Muslims over there and tell them how great the United States is. My response is, what we need is for the United States to rethink its policies, number one, and number two, to finance or support or fund people-to-people diplomacy. So, for example, Occidental College with Baghdad University, developing an exchange of ideas and conversations and learning about what's happening in Baghdad or what's happening in Karachi in Pakistan. But to develop people-to-people diplomacy is really the only way I see it changing, because government-to-government diplomacy has failed us, and we can't keep putting all our hope on our government to do the right thing. They won't unless the people demand change. Until we say that's enough, there's too much killing, there's too much suffering, and there's too much scapegoating, quite frankly. So I believe in that people-to-people diplomacy as a way of addressing these oppressive repercussions of our policies.
We'll talk about transitions. So the last question for us, and so everyone please, also, I'm just gonna take a second here and let the full weight of that last set of questions, Professor Crawford, and your responses settle in. That was a lot, really great stuff. But please think about questions you might have about any part of our conversation, audience members and students, and just put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to them right now. So talking about changing our tactics, let's maybe transition to this upcoming Supreme Court case. So the Supreme Court is going to hear a case that you referenced earlier called the Fazaga case. That's about the abuse of national security powers that were given to the United States government or seized by the United States government after 9/11. So maybe we can start by talking a bit about that case, and then talk about how it's related to this overinvestment in a kind of law enforcement, military, surveil and seize approach. Then we can talk a little bit about what we can do to pressure for change. But maybe let's start with the Fazaga case if you want to do that.
Sure. So is the audience familiar with the Fazaga case, or do we have to?
I doubt it. Maybe just like a primer.
Okay. So this is a case where an Irvine mosque, I think it's actually called the Islamic Institute of Irvine, or Orange County. They reported somebody to the FBI who was talking about bombing and killing and things like that. And the FBI did not return the call to the mosque. And so they wonder, the FBI keeps saying report crimes, see something, say something. And what happened, they later found out that the guy that they were reporting was an actual FBI agent who was planted in the mosque to basically just hang out there. And he would go with guys to the gym, and he would hang out in the mosque and talk to women and talk to young people, and he would always be trying to instigate things. And so it turned out that it was disclosed that he was an FBI agent, and then he later turned against the FBI, and I'm not sure if he filed the case against them or what, but his name was Craig Montiel. And so this is known as the Fazaga case because the imam at that time was Yasser Fazaga, very prominent imam in our community. And what it entailed is that this guy was on a witch hunt, and he admits that he was on a witch hunt, and he admits that he was basically trained that Islam is a threat, and that Muslims are the fifth column in America. And so his job was to go and catch people by saying stupid things, which most of these counterterrorism cases that they considered foiled plots, a lot of them involved just people who needed money, who agreed with the agent provocateur on a few things, and then they would catch them in a sting operation. Newburgh Sting is a wonderful documentary on that. I recommend that to everybody to watch that, called The Newburgh Sting. But in any case, the reason why this happened is more important than the case. I mean, the case is important, of course. And I know we signed on an amicus with Fazaga on this case. And I think it's, it should be heard in the Supreme Court soon. And this is important for all Americans because if it can be done against Muslims, it can be done against anybody. And I think that's the lesson that we have to learn from what's happened in the last 20 years. But what was driving this is really what is embedded in our government and much of our law enforcement agencies. This idea that they are at war with Islam, even though many U.S. officials will disavow that there's a war against Islam. So no, it's a war against Islamists. It's a war against ISIS. It's a war against Al-Qaeda. But then they say, but we want to destroy the caliphate. What does that mean when you say destroy the caliphate? Either you don't know what you're talking about, or you really are anti-Muslim. The caliphate is something that for Muslims, it was a great part of the history, that the golden age in Spain, for example, happened because of the caliphate, because the Muslims developed a system of governance and of civilization and of scientific advancements at that time that created the golden age in Spain, where Jews and Muslims and Christians were really developing the most advanced techniques in culture and science and art at that time. And the caliphate really protected non-Muslims throughout the time. And when Jews were kicked out of Spain, they went to the caliphate in Turkey, the Ottoman caliphate, and they were protected there, were protected in North Africa. So the idea of a caliphate being the enemy because ISIS uses the word caliphate is stupid. It's like the KKK or South Africa using democracy, and therefore democracy is bad. So that's one thing. Then they say, well, this is a war against jihad. Jihad does not mean holy war. That's a crusader term. Jihad to every Muslim is in the Quran, and the Quran says, strive with all your might, all you can. And the Prophet told us that the biggest jihad is the jihad against the self, the struggle against the tyranny and the oppression in your heart. So work against that, and then you will be a better human being. So it's to really excel and advance yourself in the highest means possible. That's what jihad means. Or they'll say, well, there's Sharia. Again, they don't know what they're talking about when they say Sharia, because Sharia simply means our way of life. I pray and I fast. I don't drink alcohol. I don't gamble. That's the Sharia. So they're saying it's a war against Sharia. While this idea of Sharia being something that is against Western society, it goes back to the clash of civilizations. So they use these terms that are Islamic terms in their nomenclature that the average American cannot discern this between a war against Islam and a war against ISIS. So to the common American, to the common person, it is a war against Islam. And that's why you have the case of Fazaga. So the case is important from a legal perspective, but it's also important because we have to start ending the exploitation of religion to support counterterrorism policy.
So yes, so let me follow up on the sort of national security part of that, since the rest of it was so powerful. FISA is a specific provision in US code that allows spying on foreign agents. And so there's a lot of latitude when you do that, obviously, right? You're spying against foreign agents who are trying to infiltrate your government or undermine your country. And so there's very little evidentiary, there's a very low evidentiary threshold to make that happen, to get subpoenas. And that is, when you were talking before about that distinction between foreign terrorist organization and domestic terrorist organization, that FISA provision is a bridge between what we're talking about now in Fazaga and that problem, which is once you're a foreign terrorist organization, then these kinds of really loose, really broad powers, almost entirely untethered, can be used against Americans, right? American citizens, American Muslims, as well as foreign agents. In the Fazaga case, I think that's one of the things that comes up, is that distinction, calling someone a terrorist organization and shifting to the idea that they're an international network, unleashes those powers that everyone thinks are reserved for enemies, unleashes them at home against what then become internal enemies. They get cast as internal enemies. So you were saying before that it's about the way in which these kinds of mechanisms affect all Americans, but we're seeing how those war on terror mechanisms are being used against Americans more broadly. We saw it this summer in the BLM protests and so on. So here's a question about that. So we have these broad powers. They were passed out of a fear of Muslims and of a fear of Islam. Like that's what gave them the impetus to pass them when people might have balked otherwise. Right. What can be done maybe in support of the Fazaga case? What kinds of specific things would you like to see targeted by pressure on our legislative representatives or our electeds to make some headway here? Right.
Yeah, and that's a great question, because the courts can only judge on what the law is. And if Congress passes a law, and I think we also know this from Japanese American internment, if the government invokes national security, the courts always side with the government until the law is changed. So the law has to be changed through our Congress, that the double standards don't exist anymore, that civil liberties is paramount to any national security policy. It should not be subsumed by this desire to say, well, we need, the government will always come and say, we need more powers. We don't have enough power to go after these guys. There are more than enough laws in the that allow law enforcement agencies with investigative powers, but they have to do it the right way, by establishing probable cause, by getting the warrants the right way, and so on and so forth. Nobody is saying that we don't want safety. We want safety, but they go overboard on this. And I think you know it more than I do, actually. So these laws have to be changed to be consistent and to make civil rights and civil liberties paramount in anything that law enforcement is doing. Number two, the way the government, the executive branch, institutionalized this discriminatory practice and suspending civil liberties, that cannot happen again. And we're getting apologies right now from the government about what happened the last 20 years, but we need more than apology. We need them to say, this will never happen to any community after us. And so how do we institutionalize these civil liberties in the way the executive branch is working is just as important.
Wonderful. So, okay. So if thank you so much for that. And I guess if the audience has any questions, you should ask them now. They may just be blown away, which is probably what it is. If any of the other professors have any questions.
I have a follow-up question on coalition politics because it's something we're really focusing on right now in a class called Justice Boot Camp. Can you talk about, you talked a bit about being kicked out of or not allowed into, not kicked out of, but not allowed into certain coalitions. Can you talk about some of those challenges and also give an example where coalitional politics has worked really well?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. Actually, it worked well in response to us getting kicked out. So for example, when pro-Israel groups would kick me out of congressional meetings, congressional hearings, coalitions, not being appointed, even in county, there was a time when, again, my mentor, Dr. Hattu, was giving a Human Relations Award for LA County, and pro-Israel groups were campaigning to rescind the award. And he says, well, I'm getting the award from LA County, not from the state of Israel. And so many American Jewish organizations came to our aid and said, yeah, this is not right. We don't want the name of Judaism or the name of Israel, for that matter, to be used to marginalize Muslims. And many American Jewish organizations are now rethinking about what's been happening in the last 20 years, that some of these right-wing pro-Israel groups, the pro-Likud, very hardline pro-Israel groups, went too far. And even the ADL, for example, apologized for being against the mosque that they were trying to build near Ground Zero, the Park 51 mosque, and the ADL opposed it. But last month during Yom Kippur, in the Day of Atonement, they said we have to atone for that mistake. So you see that reaction, and it tells us as Muslims also, even though we're stereotyped, we should not stereotype others. And you're going to find the good and the bad in every community. We say, the world is not divided into Jews, Muslims, and Christians. The world is divided into stupid people and intelligent people. So, so just keep working with the intelligent people, and hopefully we'll have a war on stupidity, and deal with it that way. So I think that's one lesson, is that you find allies, even though a group calling themselves in the name of a certain faith or a certain background opposed to you. On the internal matter, in terms of Muslims, I think, and people that are like-minded opposing us because they don't like our policies, I think there needs to be a little more sophistication in how we deal with problems. Number one, we're on the same team. We're all trying to establish justice. Number two, there's no one way of finding a solution. And number three, none of us can do it alone. We need a coalition. The coalition is the way to go about doing our work. And there needs to be some honest conversation about, effective engagement and coalition building, and working with people that we agree with in terms of our values and principles, but we disagree with their politics. How do we work with them?
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time. So
All right.
Always great to have you at Oxy. And we like this idea about affiliating ourselves across the world and within the United States. Thanks for that idea. There's a new initiative in our department. Yeah. Thanks to Professor Crawford. Thanks to Professor Heldman. Thank you for all of you attending. If you have questions that you think of later, or were for some reason that no one will understand, nervous to ask, please just email them and we'll share them. And best to everyone, have a wonderful Thursday. Salam, thanks for your work for the past 20 years in making LA and the US a better place.
Thank you.
Incredible.
And thank you to Oxy for doing exactly that for all of us and for our future leaders. Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you
good
all.
day.
Bye.